discussion on allowing crisis cartels. Today's webinar is part of our series called Law with the Difference, where we have tied up with the digital media partner, The Print, to bring to you some of more details about our briefing book, which consists of 25 ideas for legal reform in a post-COVID India, where we have looked at what kind of legal and institutional reforms India will need to manage the so-called new normal that we are all currently facing. We have with us today a very interesting panel. We have Dr. Magali Eben. She is a lecturer in competition law at the University of Glasgow. She previously taught EU and UK competition law as well as European Union law at the University of Leeds. We also have with us Manjushree, who's a research fellow at the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy. She's currently based out of Bangalore. Dr. Eben Magali is joining us from Glasgow. And welcome to you both, and so glad to have you on this panel.
Thank you, Alok.
Thanks for having me.
Right. So let's just jump right into the discussion. And like at least for me, I have studied competition law. I have practiced competition law, but crisis cartels are, I think, a fairly new concept for me at least. And what I thought we could do is perhaps, Manjushree, if you could just take us through what is the basic idea behind crisis cartels, right? Because I, for one, cannot ever imagine myself saying the sentence, "We need a cartel." Nobody in the world says it's a good idea. But we are saying a crisis cartel may be something that's a good idea and that's needed. So Manjushree, can you just give us like a broad picture of what we mean by crisis cartels and why is it that they might sometimes be a good idea?
Right. So I'll address that in two parts, Alok. First, let's look at what crisis cartels are. Then we'll move on to addressing as to why we need them. So let's begin with what cartels are. Now, cartels are essentially horizontal arrangements between rivals in any given market where they come together and decide that they will not compete. Now, this is typically, as you said, understood to be harmful because they have a tendency to artificially tweak the demand and supply mechanism in the market and thereby inflate prices. And this is pretty much why most antitrust regimes across the world look at cartels as a hardcore violation of competition law. And this is the case in India too. We understand it to be presumptively harmful and unless proven otherwise. Now, the central idea that I try to convey through my piece is that now cartels are not always bad. And I say this because the understanding that cartels are bad is based on the presumption that there is a well-functioning and competitive market that exists. Now, several developmental economists have tried to divert our attention to the impact of such cartels on a not so well-functioning market, and especially ones during the times of a crisis. And they believe that there are certain benefits that these cartels can bring to a market, which sometimes outweigh its cons. And these benefits range from ensuring that economies of scale is preserved for a lot of industries. It is to ensure that a lot of people are not laid off and there is not rampant unemployment, and to a large extent to also ensure that certain industries stay afloat in the market and there is not a lot of bankruptcy. Now, these are some of the benefits that developmental economists say that crisis cartels can bring to the market. But this does not mean that all sorts of crises or all sorts of economic downturns merit the formation of a cartel. It should strictly be restricted to times of structural overcapacity. And I say this because structural overcapacity, if left unchecked, can lead to industrial or sectoral failures at times. Now, structural overcapacity is a situation where the industry is designed to produce way more than what is consumed. And it is so, the extent of this distortion is so deep that market forces cannot correct it, which is why we would need something of this sort to correct it. Now, this is pretty much why I think crisis cartels at the times of crisis, especially when characterized by structural overcapacity, is needed. Therefore, to sum it up, I think crisis cartels are essentially cartels formed as a result of an ongoing crisis or in response to an ongoing crisis where market players come together in order to tackle structural overcapacity.
Okay. And just before we go to Dr. Magali, a hypothetical example, right? I mean, we don't have this concept yet in Indian law. Can you give us like a hypothetical example as to which sector this might really work for and how it might be? And how we might allow a crisis cartel in a sector? Manjushree, I sort of wanted you to like sort of elaborate can you give a hypothetical example of
Okay,
what would...
so sorry, I thought you were directing this to
No.
Magali.
Before I go to...
Okay, so structure, first, let's look at which industries or which sectors would need them the most. So I think those sectors which have high fixed costs, as in that involve heavy inventory and heavy sort of like heavy inventory and high production cost, which is a fixed cost that is involved, these sectors are most likely affected by structural overcapacity. And the reason I say this is because when such industries are hit by overcapacity, there is a tendency that they engage in a war of attrition of sorts. And it's a proven phenomenon that, when overcapacity hits, most producers in such sectors think it's more prudent to produce in full capacity as opposed to reduce production and underutilize their resources. And there are two reasons for why they do this. One, that they do this in order to meet economies of scale. And that means that they try and ensure that their per unit production cost remains as low as possible. And second, they also do this because they believe this will ensure that, or this effort will induce other players to exit the market, which pretty much results in a war of attrition. Now, in economic theory, this is a classic case of prisoner's dilemma, where each player awaits the other to exit the market, but none of them exit, and production still continues in full swing. And this will only worsen the structural overcapacity that's already at play. And this is why I think those sectors which have high fixed costs are more likely to be hit with overcapacity. And these are sectors that we would largely have to look at crisis cartels to help deal with structural overcapacity.
So, Dr. Magali, since this concept, and I sort of went through Manjushree's briefing book page, and she talks about two cases in the European Court of Justice where such crisis cartels have been allowed. Can you sort of tell us what these cases are about, and what did the European Court of Justice actually say in the context of EU competition law?
Right. So I think the concept of crisis cartels in Europe is quite fascinating because something that you need to understand is that we don't have a per se condemnation of cooperation between competitors in the EU. So our law has a part that says that anti-competitive agreements are null, they're void, but it also says, well, if certain conditions are satisfied, they're actually okay. Yeah. And this has historical reasons, because before we created the European Economic Community, cartels were actually a feature of a lot of national industrial policy in Europe. So it would have been a hard sell to ban them once all the countries came together. But that's led to quite an interesting phenomena where you have a part of our article, which is Article 101, a part of our article actually gives you an out, a possibility to allow cartels. You can think about it like this, right? We are in favor of competition, and if we're in favor of competition because we think it leads to a certain economic outcome, then if it doesn't do that, maybe sometimes we need to abandon competition. That is kind of the philosophy behind it. So the European Commission has used this. It's used this since the 1970s to allow crisis cartels, but only in specific industries where there were clear signs of overcapacity, which was structural. It wasn't just temporary, it looked like a long-term problem. And these are industries such as the fiber industry, the petrochemical industry, cement, bricks, those kind of industries. It's important to know that this is the European Commission, and until the 2000s, the European Commission could do this on its own. It has the exclusive competence to enforce EU competition law. Right. Since the early 2000s, that has changed. National competition authorities can also enforce competition law. And actually, I think this is an important point because I'm not sure we would be able to pass a crisis cartel now. The reason I say this is because the conditions under 1013 for allowing a cartel are actually, you can interpret them strictly or broadly. And the Commission used to be very broad. So it would say, okay, under 1013, if an agreement improves production and improves progress, then we can allow it. And so it did that. It said, there's a cartel that has occurred in the fibers industry, which was the synthetics fiber case. But the cartel actually is an agreement where different companies agree to close their production facilities and compensate each other for doing that. And this means that inefficient companies are leaving the market, efficient companies remain, production improves, costs are reduced. This is great. What's interesting though, and I think this is a fundamental thing to emphasize, is that those kind of agreements were not allowed to have pricing agreements in it. They weren't allowed to have output agreements in it. It was very much an agreement on closing production facilities. It wasn't about setting common prices. And I think that is an important point to make. In the EU, you have an idea of indispensability, which means that you can only adopt a certain agreement, including all of its provisions, if each provision is essential, is necessary for achieving that goal, in this case, restructuring to make the market more efficient. And the Commission always, in every single one of the cases, was like, I don't think price agreements are necessary. In fact, the indispensability requirement went so far as to say, if there are alternative policies we can use, maybe crisis cartels aren't an option. That being said, it still adopted quite a few, right? So in those industries, it was quite lenient. It said, there's a crisis, this cartel might solve it. I note, and I said this already, this was before 2000s. This was from 1970s to 2000. Since the 2000s, the European Commission has adopted a much more narrow focus. And Article 1013 says that you can only have such an agreement if the benefits of the agreement benefit consumers. Before the 2000s, the Commission took this really broadly. It said, a healthy industry is to the benefit of consumers. Now, I can't say this with 100% certainty because we haven't had any cases, but now it is likely that the Commission might say a crisis cartel doesn't achieve those benefits. We had almost one case in 2011, almost, but the case actually never went to trial because it was withdrawn. It's called the Irish beef case. And in the context of that case, the European Commission made a statement that crisis cartels lead to reduction of fixed costs, not variable costs. And that variable costs are the ones that benefit consumers. Fixed costs are not. I have no idea what would happen if we tried it now. And I don't actually know if we would allow a crisis cartel now. But yeah, in a global overview, until the 2000s, the European Commission was in favor of crisis cartels. Now I'm not so sure.
Right, and this, I just a sort of one follow-up question on what you just said. This change in view, we haven't yet seen, like, say, a judgment or any order of the Commission which sort of says that that was wrong and shouldn't be allowed. But it's more in terms of the change in the thinking, the saying that, and what you just pointed out at the end, that crisis cartels, should generally be allowed only when they sort of compromise on fixed costs, but the maximum benefit is to variable costs, which sort of suggests that perhaps that benefit to the consumer is not happening from crisis cartels.
It's hard, isn't it? Because I actually kind of agree with the European Commission pre the 2000s that the consumer benefits from a healthy industry. The consumer is an employee, right? The consumer has a long-term interest in a healthy industry. But when you know that the national authorities all have diverging views, there is kind of merit in the Commission being more strict and saying, look, this is how the policy works, and this is how it should work.
Right.
Maybe we would need a specific guidance if we wanted to allow cartels, where the Commission says, actually, we want crisis cartels. These are the circumstances under which to do it. I think a side note is that crisis cartels should, I think, be a measure of last resort. And if the European Union can work together in other ways, then maybe we won't need them. Just the UK has adopted a exclusion order, which the UK until January is still in the EU, right? Has adopted an exclusion order for ferry transport on the Isle of Wight. But that was a very specific circumstance of a secluded, isolated place that would otherwise not get any access to essential goods. So that's pretty much all we have to guide us. It's hard to figure out.
Yeah, and I think that sort of also answers the next question which I sort of had, which is how do we identify the sectors? But I want to very quickly go to Manjushree about something that I happened to spot in the last couple of days, in fact, in Indian papers. These were two cases which concerned penalties imposed by the Competition Commission of India for cartelization. If I'm not mistaken, the cases relate to railways tendering and ball bearings, if I'm not mistaken. But there, very interestingly, the Competition Commission finds that they are, let's say, in a cartel, but does not impose a penalty on them saying, oh, COVID is going on, we don't want to affect them with a penalty. I just want to understand, is this like what we have in mind, like how a crisis cartel will play out? Because, I mean, one of the points which sort of came out from Magali saying was that pricing will not be, you can't have an agreement on price, but here was an agreement on who will bid for a government project, right? And that kind of stuff. So I just wanted to understand, do we see this as a way that the Competition Commission is trying to feel for some jurisprudence during a crisis, or should we see this as something else entirely?
Alok, to answer that very quickly, I think that's not what we understand as crisis cartels. And I say this because there are two recent orders, as you just pointed out, the first one in June and the second one in July. And in both of them actually conclusively find that there is cartelization in those particular industries. The first one concerned, as you said, the automotive bearing industry, where there was a cartel between 2009 and 2014. And the second one considered was in the context of bid rigging. In procurement of railway brakes, and the cartel there was between 2009 and 2017. Now, one fundamental difference to keep in mind here is that if we are looking at crisis cartels, then the starting point or the trigger for the cartelization must be the crisis itself. But in this case, the cartelization was way before COVID even happened. It was between 2009, 2014 in the first instance, and 7 and 17 in the second instance. So this, I don't believe, is cartelization, but this does look like the Competition Commission of India is considering the economic hardship arising out of COVID as a factor while it's determining penalty. Now, this approach, however, can be problematic. And I say this because at least in the first case, the CCI does not even reason as to why there is no penalty being imposed. At least in the second one, it says that these concern MSMEs, micro and small and medium enterprise industries, and we do not want to aggravate their hardships given that there is COVID going on, and we will not impose a penalty. Now, this is problematic on three grounds, because there is no clarity as to who this will apply to. And in the future, if a case were to come up, which was not an MSME and which was some other industry, there is no clarity if the same sort of leniency would be applicable to them. There is no clarity on how much would the reduction be, because in this case, there was absolutely no penalty. But we are not sure if the same approach will be followed for other cartelists if they ever happen to come up before the CCI. And the third is that this might be used as this might open a floodgate where all cartelists would want to rush to the CCI to justify past and present behavior, saying that, oh, this is COVID, I'm going to put my hands up, you cannot punish me. And I don't think we can let that happen, because it's sort of a patchwork approach, right? I mean, it's not really a principled approach to tell us how COVID is really going to factor into the CCI's broader policy on economic reforms and how it's going to treat anti-competitive behavior. So yes, I think in terms of these two specific cases, I think there is a need. It only highlights the need for a more principled approach by the CCI.
And just how would this principled approach be? Do you suggest that the CCI proactively put out legislation on this front, or do you, advisories, legislations, or orders, or do you think the CCI is best suited to wait to get an appropriate case and then on those facts laid down?
No, not entirely. So I think one interesting tool that the Commission has is the ability to launch market studies into sectors that it believes that, that can suffer from structural overcapacity, or simply sectors that are going to be very massively affected by COVID. So I think a starting point in this case is that in this situation is that the CCI must ideally launch market studies to see which sectors are going to be very badly affected by COVID. And I think what really adds on also here is that it's the RBI's forecast on a recession, right? Because when you look at COVID in the light of the recession, it also makes it known to us that even if this health crisis comes to an end, supply demand and consumption in a lot of industries might not improve in the near future. So I think it becomes important for the CCI as the competition authority and someone that has economic expertise to launch market studies to truly understand the impact of COVID on certain sectors and what implications they may have on competition policy. And basis such evidence, I think it should come out with a guidance note or guidelines for that matter to tell us whether COVID is simply going to be a mitigating factor in looking at penalties, or whether you want to actively promote cartelization in cases where industries are going to be hit with structural overcapacity. So there are many options that the CCI has in this case, but I think it's just important to stick to a principled one and be clear about what they're doing.
Yeah. Before I go into the final set of questions that I have for Magali, just a point to all our listeners. You can send in questions in the Q&A tab on our Zoom, if you're logged in through Zoom, or you can raise your hand. I'll come to you for the questions. Or if you're watching this on Facebook Live, you can type out the questions and maybe Sonali can just direct them to me once the session is done, and we'll try and answer it in the last 5 minutes. So that's in case, based on whatever you've heard, if you have some questions and clarifications that you want to ask. Dr. Magali, I just come to the last couple of points that I had that we could discuss in this webinar. One thing is, and it's a very straightforward thing, have they worked? Right, we've seen that, and as you mentioned, that the European Commission itself may have a very different view on whether we should allow crisis cartels or not. But has allowing crisis cartels actually worked for that sector? Because at the end of the day, we are talking about a sector of the economy, and as you pointed out, it involves people's jobs, it involves people's supplies, it involves a lot of other important things. Do we have a good case study or an example where a crisis cartel, actually saved the industry or helped it get through a difficult period of time?
Your use of the word straightforward made me laugh. It's not straightforward at all. So, I mean, first of all, there's loads of different situations in which crisis cartels have been adopted, and I think the different problems and different solutions. But it's not straightforward because we don't know. So the evidence we have is for the most part anecdotal and not empirically based. And the reason why it's very difficult to say whether a cartel actually helped save a sector is because you don't know what the counterfactual is, right? So you would have to know what would have happened if we didn't allow a cartel. It's very important to know that the European Commission doesn't adopt cartels or encourage them. It allows them when they already exist. So it intervenes. Right. Something has already happened and says, okay, I can understand why there is a benefit to this. But we don't know what would have happened if there was no cartel. We don't know what would have happened if another policy had been used instead. Plus, in most case studies that I've seen, a cartel was one factor in a lot of factors. There was loads of state intervention, there was state aid, so there were subsidies, there were cartels, there were mergers, so there were loads of different things happening at the same time. It's very difficult to pull them apart and say, well, this led to this solution and this benefit. I read a study on the synthetic fibers cartel and it made me laugh, so I'm not gonna name the author. But this was amazing and it saved the industry, and there was no empirical evidence. There were statements of politicians and I was like, really? Are politicians now our guide to what works? Because we're doomed. Another study, which I found really interesting, was, I think Manjushree will have read it, which was Simon Evenet's contribution for the OECD in 2011. He goes through all the empirical evidence that happens at the time, and his conclusion is sometimes they work, sometimes they don't work, and we don't know why they work because we can't actually tell whether it was a cartel who worked or something else. Okay. However, having said that, the European national history is one of cartels. And a lot of, and this is very correlation, not causation, but a lot of economies used cartels as an active industrial policy and spurred economic growth. I don't know if it is causally linked, but it is a feature that I think we should investigate. I would like to see more empirical research into whether there was a link between the cartel and the boosting of the economy. Of course, a side note is that this is also a European history of imperialism and using your cartels to invade other countries. So I'm not sure how well received that research would be. But basically, it is not straightforward. I can only give you anecdotal evidence of it working.
Right. and which sort of is interesting because to me, I've been fascinated by the differences between the American approach to competition law and the European approach to competition law. And it has to do with the history of the two regions also. When I say America, I mean the United States, and the Europe, I mean now what is the European Union. It also has to do with what has been the various impulses, the political and the economic impulses in doing so. And I think when we talk about crisis cartels, we also have to, I guess, we make a very valid point that we can't entirely ignore the fact that cartels have been part of the economic history of the European Union, that you've had certain cartels which were allowed to run and had a very free reign. And I think in some sense, it's been true of India as well. Before the current competition law came into existence, there was a joke going on amid lawyers that if you want to know how well the MRTP, which was the previous version of the MRTP Commission, is functioning, you need to go to the lobby of this hotel on this day, and literally outside the meeting room would be a board saying meeting of the cement cartel, so and so to fix prices. So you'd be okay, right? So how well the MRTP Commission is functioning. So we've had a certain history with cartels in India, and I suppose there is a certain danger that cartels might become much more powerful. In a sense that if they're unregulated, and which is also why we have the present competition law as it stands, and I'll try a different way to address this. So, maybe before we close this webinar and open it up for questions from the audience, maybe Magali and Manjushree, can you give us some sense of what are the dangers we should look out for in saying that, okay, we find there is a good case made out that in this particular sector, we need to allow a crisis cartel. But what are the parameters which we should keep in mind in limiting the scope of this cartel? At what point do we say enough is enough, we can't allow this? One important limit, I think Magali mentioned, which was price. You can't obviously allow a cartel which fixes prices, and it has to be more structural rather than. So how do we ensure that cartel like this doesn't become a long-lasting cartel?
Well, I think the very first thing is, are there any alternatives? Because a crisis cartel will, whether you want it or not, it will create a culture of cooperation in an industry, right? So you have to be careful not to encourage an industry, the players, to get used to sitting together in a room and chatting about things. So in the EU, we have clear rules on state aid, so subsidies. I think maybe subsidies could be an alternative. The problem with subsidies is the taxpayer will pay. Whereas if you have a crisis cartel, it's the consumer who still wants the product who pays, which in a way is more fair. You could also have mergers and acquisitions and all of that. So you need to look at alternatives first. If you do think a crisis cartel is better, and there might be reasons for that, you need to avoid confidential information exchanges. I think that is very important, right? You should make it so that there is a third party running and managing the arrangement, so that you avoid having the company sit together, the CEO sit together in a room and saying, we're supposed to be talking about which facilities we're going to close, but how much did you charge for that ton of brick last month? I think that is something we definitely should avoid. It should be limited in time. A crisis is limited in time, so should a crisis cartel. Like I said, I don't think you should have pricing information exchanged, prices set. There's a caveat I would make, which is the Commission clearly didn't like output restrictions because they have an impact on price. But in a temporary crisis, you might have no choice but to have output restrictions as well, which is what the UK is doing with the Isle of Wight ferries, which is an interesting case to look at. So it is difficult to not allow them to have those kind of restrictions in. So I don't know how that would be managed. Most importantly, I think the Commission and any competition agencies should say, this is not forever. The moment this stops, we will enforce the law again. So, and then it should stick with that. There shouldn't be a culture shift within the authorities. And I think that is a risk. I don't know how you manage that.
Okay. Manjushree,
Yeah, to sort of add on to that, I think I agree with Magali, because I think cartels are not only stealthy in the way they operate, they're also very difficult to break, right?
Mm.
So I think it is also important that we don't let this fester for longer than required. So I think I will just add what the Competition Commission in India can do to avoid such a situation. Maybe it always helps to have like a sunset clause of sorts to see exactly where you would want this sort of agreement or an arrangement to end between participants. And along with that, I think there is also vigilant monitoring that's required, because at the end of the day, we will also have to see that the intended purpose of the agreement is met and the cooperation does not extend beyond that. And that becomes very essential. So another way to ensure that, I think, is if the CCI were to legalize crisis cartels, I think it will help if uh, parties that seek to sort of enter into these agreements, if they get an approval from the commission before going ahead, that way the commission will know exactly who to keep an eye out for and who they must really be able to monitor. Yeah.
Okay, great. That makes sense, and I think that sort of has given us a very good understanding of this concept of a crisis cartel, where it can work, where it can't. And I suppose this is still a very emerging area. It is something that we need a lot more research on, it, not just in terms of the law, but also economically. And as Magali made the right point, there is not enough empirical evidence which tells us exactly this will work and exactly this won't work. But there are dangers that we have to watch out for when we're allowing for this crisis cartels. So we have about 5 minutes left, and I'll go through these. We have about 5 questions, and nobody has raised their hand. So I'll go through these 5 questions one by one. Let me start with, there are two, Pranav has 2 questions for Magali. Are competition authorities likely to be comfortable with assistance from external sources than with the crisis cartel, even though it is equally likely that efficiency enhancing benefits of competition will be blunted in both cases? Second question is, in a time like the present, when attention and funds of governments are occupied in dealing with public health issues, what are the other potential? I think you sort of answered that. So maybe in the first question, Magali, if you could answer, are competition authorities more likely to be comfortable with assistance from external sources, rather than allowing for a crisis cartel?
So I think it's a cultural thing. I think in the European Union, I think subsidies are much more palpable, much more acceptable. We have an quite extensive state aid framework which sets out under which conditions subsidies from national governments are allowed, and that is the idea that you don't want to distort competition in the union as a whole. So we have quite an extensive framework on subsidies, so we have more experience with it. And indeed, we are now adopting a review of the state aid so that more subsidies can be given in the EU. So I think by far the European competition authorities are more comfortable now with subsidies. But then that's a cultural thing. We don't mind the taxpayer paying, right? I mean, so it's cultural. I don't think you can say that for any authority in any country. And even in the EU, there are divergences. The UK is less comfortable with the taxpayer paying, for example. So it depends, really.
There was another question I'll just take. I clubbed these 2 questions, one from Shama and one from, I know they're 2 separate questions, but maybe Manjushree can answer both these questions. Shama asks, what are the sectors in India where there is a problem of structural overcapacity? And Jay asked the second question, which is more relevant. Why does the COVID crisis create a situation that causes structural capacity rather than simply a short to medium term economic downturn? So Manjushree, maybe you can sort of, at least in the specific Indian context, what is it about the COVID crisis which causes structural overcapacity, and what could be the sectors in India which specifically might suffer this problem?
Sure. So the reason I think that the COVID crisis might trigger a structural overcapacity is because I think we are not supposed to look at the COVID crisis in isolation. We must also take into account that our economy wasn't doing fairly well before the COVID crisis hit us. And the fact that the RBI had predicted that, we know for sure that there is a recession coming, and there is definitely no scope for improvement in demand or consumption in the foreseeable future. Now, all of this clubbed together makes it look like whatever overcapacity is presently there might stay for longer than we intend it to be, and longer, and it might be something that's quite deep for market forces to correct. And this is why I believe that structural overcapacity, I mean, COVID might be the starting point of overcapacity, which might turn structural with time to come. And on the Indian sectors that I believe where structural overcapacity might be hit, I will start with a qualifier saying that I think we are 4 months into COVID right now. I don't think anybody knows the true impact of, the true impact of what this is going to mean for the Indian economy. So from this vantage point, it will be difficult to predict which sectors are going to be badly affected. But what we can do definitely is look out for red flags in certain sectors that have already been operating with overcapacity under prolonged losses, and suggest that the CCI should launch market studies into those specific sectors to see what the future holds for those sectors. And I think the two sectors I would like to point out are the airline industry and the automotive manufacturing industry, because for a couple of years before COVID itself, both these industries were suffering with a lot of overcapacity and have also been operating under prolonged losses. So I think these are the two sectors that we need to keep our eye out for, and perhaps suggest that the CCI, if it all decides to do market studies in this regard, these might be good sectors to start with.
Sure. And
would you mind if I add a small point to that, which is I think it's a good question about what the COVID crisis will do. So I don't think either of us thinks a cyclical downturn should be addressed through a crisis cartel, but COVID might either have a short-term demand effect where people are uncertain, they don't go and buy, or it might be the beginning of a long-lasting shift in culture. And if that is the case, then problems that already exist might be exacerbated. And I think that's an important thing to look out for.
Okay. There's one final question by Pranay, and we can close the webinar with this. There was an advisory passed by CCI allowing cooperation amongst competitors. Should we see this as a step towards creating crisis cartels in India, or do you think there is something more that's needed?
No, so I don't think that in any way indicates that the Commission is okay with crisis cartels, because it is looking exclusively at coordination to treat supply problems, and it's really not looking to treat questions or problems associated with overcapacity. So it's different when you say you're going to allow coordination, because at the end of it, you do not want the consumer to not have access to a certain good. So we are essentially looking at supply related shortages, which is largely in terms of groceries, medicinal equipment, etc. But I don't think the advisory is aimed to treat or even tackle questions of structural overcapacity. So that has to be really freshly looked into.
Okay. Thanks, Manjushree. Thanks, Dr. Magali. Thank you for joining us from Glasgow. It's been a very interesting discussion. I basically did not notice the time fly by. I had to keep checking to make sure that I wasn't going over time. This has been a fascinating discussion. This is a new area for me. I do study and work on competition law, but this is an area which has given me a lot of insights, and I'm sure our audience also would have appreciated the many insights and the many useful takeaways that you have given from this discussion. And hopefully the Competition Commission of India will think more deeply about how to address competition law issues in the midst of the COVID crisis. So thank you once again for joining us. I hope all of you who joined us on this webinar also had a good experience of listening to us.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you all. Thank you, Alok. Thank you, Magali.
Bye.
Bye.